Hi guys, and welcome to the third episode of The Whiteboard with myself, Ben Jarman, and Dan Cook. This is the first episode we've recorded after Fulham were crowned champions of the EFL Championship for 2021. And yeah, an incredible season from the Whites. Marco Silva's swashbuckling side cruising to championship victory, leaving a trail of goals in their wake, 106 scored in the league. And just some incredible football. And as usual, I'm joined by Dan Cook. And Dan, how did you feel about this season? And how do you feel about us going into next season?
It's been amazing, Jarms. I mean, we did the round table recently for the website, and I was writing it on the way to uni last week, and genuinely got a little bit emotional writing it, just talking about how amazing this season has been, and it gives me massive optimism for next season. I'm really optimistic, I think.
Yeah, I hear you completely on the emotional side of things because, like you, when I was writing mine, I also got a little bit emotional. I don't think it's often that football brings out that kind of raw emotion in people, but I think this year certainly did with everything that happened throughout the course of the season. Obviously, a lot of records broken, but then there's the points around Paul Parish and how the supporters all pulled together, the scenes when we got promoted, and then obviously the scenes for wrapping up the championship with that 7-0 victory was, I don't think we'll forget it in a while. And for me, for that to be my last season on UK soil for a couple of years will go down in my memory forever, I think.
The perfect send-off, the Jarms send-off to Canada.
I wish they were doing it for me, but they certainly weren't. So today we've got a couple of questions that have actually come in from listeners or watchers, if you will, of the whiteboard. One of them from Chris Frank, who's Cottage Analytica, and this is the second question that we'll be looking at, and it's in relation to Mitrović. But first one was actually from a lot of people on both Twitter and in the Telegram group and in various other channels, especially those that have slid into our email DMs, as it were. But this is looking at Fulham out of possession, and in particular looking at that defensive midfield role, or as yourself and Jack Collins like to call it, the 6 role going forward.
Yeah, I think it's one thing, and we've touched upon it as well in the whiteboard, in the sense that when we were looking at Tosin and Tim Reeb and their sort of propensity to dive into tackles, one of the causes of that being the fact that they tend to be quite exposed with the ball sort of missing our 6, and then you've got opposition runners going at them. I think it sort of sets off panic alarms going. So we thought we'd have a look at sort of and try and explain where those issues are coming from in that defensive midfield role. And so I guess if we start with this example, I think it's a prime example against Sheffield United at home.
Yeah.
Sheffield United, who we had a terrible record against this year, and potentially due to that intensity and that willingness to be direct and counter. But we've got Seri highlighted there. He's got the little circle underneath him. It's a failed cross that comes in from the right-hand side. And the first thing I've done is pinpointed Harrison Reed and Fabio Carvalho, who were Seri's partners in midfield. And I think that's important because you can see how high up they are. And that's fine because that's what they're there to do. We want them in and around the area causing issues there. But it does mean that Seri has a massive job, if we do lose the ball, of trying to prevent the opposition being dangerous in transition. So you see the ball comes out here, it misses him, it goes over the top of him, and Iliman Ndiaye picks it up. And you can see already he's the wrong side of him, which is a big issue. And we've got that area highlighted there in behind Anthony Robinson. That's just a danger area. What's left behind that is Tosin and Tim Ream, basically. And that's where Ndiaye is going to go. And from the very beginning, that's something that you need your 6 preventing happening. You really can't afford to let teams, and especially if we're talking Premier League teams, you can't allow Premier League players to get into these situations. And so Ndiaye hits that area, as you would expect. And we've got it here. I mean, he's the wrong side of them. You've got 3 runners going, Tosin and Tim Ream backtracking, Anthony Robinson furiously trying to get back into position. And we're just so exposed. And this is where I think we've pointed fingers at Tosin and Tim Ream sometimes for backing off or being too rash and not just decision-making being poor. But this is the last thing you want as a centre-back is nimble, agile forwards running directly at you, running back towards your own goal, because it's so tough. And we just roll it on, and still you see, I mean, Seri gets nowhere near. We're all over the place, and this results in the goal. And while it looked awful at the time, and you sort of, as soon as you watch it back, you can see that whilst people had a go at Tim Ream and Tosin for backtracking so much, in that situation, if they go to the ball there, then I think it makes the situation even worse if they don't win it. And so I think that's the problem you get with that number 6. If he's not reading the play, if he's not being able to sweep up and prevent those counterattacks, especially in the Premier League, we're going to get really, really found out. So I don't know what you think from that sort of Sheffield United example, but that's one of the things I think we've seen quite a few times this season.
Yeah, no, I wholly agree on this. I think Seri is wonderful for us when we're in possession of the football. And obviously when he doesn't have the football itself, he's great in that he makes spaces, he can create those pockets, and he can create something from deep. That's brilliant. I think when we are out of possession and a team is intense, and not a lot of teams this season have put a lot of pressure on the number 6, other than Sheffield United. Coventry definitely did in both of their wins against us this season. And Barnsley, one of my standout memories of this season, and particularly Seri and struggling on that 6, was against Barnsley, and he got ran over by 3 or 4 midfielders pretty much every single time they countered. And this is, I think, the major thing that we're going to see in the Premier League is that whilst the number 10 per se in its traditional role is no longer particularly prevalent in the Prem, I think there are players in there that have that hybrid ability to act as a 10 and an 8. So you have the likes of Trossard, you have the likes of Coutinho, who are going to be able to pick up in those little pockets and attack Seri. And if you don't have someone in there that's a big body, that is defensively minded, and Seri admitted it himself, he doesn't often play the number 6. And when he does, he's not the most defensively minded 6. So you're going to have to get a big upgrade in there to stop those attacks at source. And I think that was kind of what Marco Silva was trying to do with Harrison Reed this season, in that you put someone who traditionally plays a defensive 6 into an 8 and you stop counters at source because he's your plug. And then you give it to Seri and he starts everything again. But in the Premier League, I think we're probably going to revert back to a more defensively minded double pivot, someone next to Harrison Reed. And whether that's Seri, I don't think so, to be quite honest with you. I think the guy who we've been linked with is anything but Jean-Michel Seri.
Yeah, I think Al-Musrati is definitely the flip side of this. You're looking at a man who's 6'2", 6'3", and seems to, based on his outputs, do all of his work out of possession. You're looking at interceptions, blocks, aerial challenges. I think that's the sort of mold of player that I think we do need, and I think we've been missing. I guess we spoke about it just before we started recording. If you wanted a Fulham-based reference for the type of player that I think we're trying to wedge in here, you're looking at someone like a Kevin McDonald, who, whilst it was I love Kevin McDonald, fantastic in possession, very composed, didn't overly complicate things, but it was his reading of the play outside of possession. He wasn't the quickest. He never was the quickest, but it was his ability to be in the right place and sort of stop those transition counters that were really important. I think this is where, if we just bring up another, and it feels bad because it feels like I'm bashing Seri here, but I'm not, because this isn't what he's really there to do, and he's never been that sort of player. And whilst he was that sort of deep line 6 who looks to dictate the tempo, you are going to get caught on the counter-attack. And I think we got away with it in the Championship because we were just so good, and we were so good in possession. In the Premier League, we're really going to struggle to get away with this sort of thing. So this is Reading at home. And now this is a little bit different because Seri's positioning here seems good. He's goal side of the counter-attack here. John Swift in possession, and we've got a little bit of more of a handle on this. I've highlighted again his other 2 midfielders in this game, who were Bobby Reed and Nat Chalobah, who again, high up the pitch, wrong side of the ball, but that's fine because that's what they're meant to be there for. But we run it on. John Swift gives the ball out wide, and again, you see that sort of gap between Seri and our 2 centre-backs, which is, again, that danger area where Tosin and Tim Ream really don't want players in possession of the ball. John Swift's going to hit that area. And I think this is where, again, that sort of defensive mindedness of Seri leaves you sort of a little bit to be desired, because he doesn't track it. He's focused on the ball at all times. And John Swift just managed to get into that area. He receives the ball. Again, you've got runners going against our back 4. We're getting flooded here, and we can't deal with it. It gets shifted out. And this, again, it ends up in a goal. It gets shifted to Ajaria, and it's 1-0 to Reading. And Seri was basically a bystander in that whole move, like he was in that Barnsley game. I remember messaging you at half-time being like, Seri's been a passenger in this game. Because in those transitions, if you're not able to read them, and if you're not physically strong enough or quick enough, you do just end up being a passenger. The ball just passes you by.
Absolutely. I think this is one of the things that didn't really happen to us this season. We were never really overrunning midfield because we held the ball for such large periods of the game. and it was never really under the magnifying glass as much as it will be in the league above. You know, it's a completely different caliber of player, and I think people always ask me what the difference is between the Championship and Premier League, because they wonder why the gap is so big. And I think a lot of it firstly comes down to athleticism, which I think a lot of our team has. But secondly, it comes down to great decision making. And I think that's where anyone from sort of the playoffs down in the Championship has a little bit lacking. They don't make great decisions, and sometimes they can fumble on the ball and they get a little bit excited and the composure lacks. I think that's where in the Premier League, you're going to get players that can slow that play right down, and they can almost look at any counter-attack in slow motion and start to pick apart a defensive six that is really weak. And this is where, if we're now going to come on to Al-Musrati in a little bit more detail, he is, as you say, the polar opposite to Seri. Guy's 6'2", really defensively minded, not the quickest, so can't cover huge amounts of ground, but is going to be somewhere that sits at the bottom of that midfield. Had a quick look at some of the stats he's getting. He's averaging around 1.4 interceptions a game, and his tackle success rate is around 74%, which is massively high. And in a physically robust league like the Primeira, I think he's going to come over and fly. If you traditionally look at the Portuguese league as somewhat of a weak spot in European football, but it's really flipped on its head recently. You get a lot of players that have come over to the Premier League and adapted quite well. You look at the likes of basically half of Wolves' squad have played in the Primeira, and they've come over here and they've done absolutely fine. I mean, you know a little bit more about Al-Musrati in terms of his percentiles and that kind of thing. So, yeah, if you could give us a bit of a snapshot, that'd be great.
Yeah, I mean, if you're just looking at things like sort of interceptions, as we're speaking, things out of possession, interceptions, blocks, clearances, he's in the sort of between the top 10 and top 2% of midfielders across Europe. So this is in comparison against all the big five leagues in Europe. So these are impressive numbers for a defensive midfielder who is not, whilst playing in a top league, not necessarily playing for one of the top sides in that league. You know, Braga are sitting in just outside that traditional top three in Portugal. And I think maybe people who will have seen him might have been in that Rangers two legs in the Europa League. Yeah. And I think he was very much a player that stood out for me in a way because he was always involved, and he was a bit of a sod, and I liked that because he knew his role, and that was to break up play. It was to be a nuisance when Rangers were in possession. And I think that's exactly the sort of mould of player we're looking for, because no one's really done that this year. And we're definitely going to need someone to do that in the Premier League. Absolutely.
I fundamentally agree. So also looking forward to the Premier League. As I said in the intro, we have a question from Chris Frank, who's Cottage Analytica, friend of the podcast, and also runs his very own socials, and all of them are great to read through. He asked about the role of Mitrović out of possession and how can we keep him firing in the Premier League, given all of the traditional stereotypical statements that he is not good at closing down, not good at man marking, blah, blah, blah. So we had a look at this in a little bit more detail. And I think you've got a couple of ideas of what Marco Silva can do to get the best out of Mitrović next year.
Definitely. And it was a great question. And everyone has to go and have a look at Chris's Twitter, Cottage Analytica, because it is fantastic, the stuff he puts out. And it really got us thinking this, because it was something that obviously last year in the Premier League was an issue because it saw Mitrović get dropped because Scott Parker didn't believe that he was good enough out of possession in the press for us to play the way we wanted to. And so I think there are two elements to this. And the first thing I wanted to bring up was the fact that I don't think he's incapable of pressing. I think we've seen it this season. The first one that sprung to mind was Birmingham away. If we see here, the ball shifts out right. Just as a side note, Ivan Cavallero was in the side at this point of the season. I'd completely forgotten that at the start of the season he was quite heavily involved. But you've got Mitrović here, and just off screen, you've got Mark Roberts, the Birmingham centre-back. And if you just roll it on, even Sunjic picks up the ball, and you can see that Mitrović instantly spots that pass is on. And you can see the gap there that is between him and Roberts. And I think this is an intelligent press because he's not quick. We know this. But as we said for a Kevin McDonald in the holding midfield role, if you're not quick, you've got to be smart. You've got to sense opportunities. You've got to see what's going on and react. And so he spots it. He makes that run. And by the time that Roberts receives the ball, you can see how much he's narrowed that gap down just by being smart, preempting that that's where the ball was going to go and getting there. And he ends up nicking it off him. He's away. He lays it off to Seri beautifully and it returns it to him and we make it 4-0. So I think that's the first thing, is that he's not incapable of pressing. And we saw it as well at home against West Brom. I think it was Robert Snodgrass who really screwed up a back pass to Sam Johnston, but it was, again, just smart from Mitrović because he sensed it. So I think that's the first thing. He's not incapable of pressing. But the second thing, and this is the thing that I really thought would be important, is maybe not necessarily so much what he does to stop the opposition, but more how he can be useful when we win the ball back. So this is against City in the FA Cup. Perfect example, because we're against Premier League opposition, the best Premier League opposition. Absolutely. And John Stones in possession here. You can see sort of Mitrović lurking here. And I think he's been told, and clearly his job here is that try and make it John Stones do something different. Don't let Fernandinho be instantly accessed, because that's what City want to do. They want to be able to play through those lines and then bring their attacking players into play. So whilst he's not directly cutting off this pass, he's very much saying, right, if you want to give this ball to Fernandinho, I'm going to make it difficult for him as soon as he receives it. So that's good. It's sort of the cutting the passing lanes, being ready just to pounce just in case something happens, like we saw against Birmingham. But where I think it gets really interesting and where I think he can be the most useful is when we win the ball back. Because this is just a second after City are in possession there. We win it back relatively high, and you can see Mitrović there, hands in the air, ready to receive. And he's got Cabano, Carvalho, Harry Wilson, all in a line alongside him, ready to go. And I think this is where he's going to be at his most dangerous and most useful out of possession, is being in a position to receive the ball once we win it back. I think we're going to play a lot quicker next year. We're going to have to. We're going to see, I think, a lot more of us playing on the counter and trying to utilize those transitions against most of the teams. There will be games when obviously we try and slow it down. We will dominate possession. But for example, against a team like City, as soon as we win that ball back, we're going to have to be quick, because otherwise we won't create anything. And so in this moment, because of the press and where he lines himself up, he is then ready to receive the ball when we do win it back. And you can see here, he gets it and he's got space. And Neeskens Cabano's already off screen because he's made that run. Harry Wilson is making that run. You've got Harrison Reed in the centre circle, who's also going to go and try and get beyond him. And I think that's where he's going to be the most dangerous, is in those transitions. He's such a key cog in our build-up play. And I think that gets missed by non-Fulham fans or non-Fulham watchers. Everyone sees the goals he scores and just assumes he's a 6-yard box poacher. But he does so much in that build-up play. And I think that's where he's going to be so useful out of possession, is if he can make sure that he doesn't get stuck pressing the left back, pressing the right back, because as soon as we win the ball back in those situations, he's not in the game. Whereas if you sit him on the opposition 6, for example, then if we do win it back, he's ready.
Yeah, wholly agree. And I think that one thing the Fulham fans are going to have to be aware of this season coming up is that his goal totals are going to drop quite heavily. He's not going to mimic this season in terms of his output for goals, but I think assist-wise, and we saw this slowly coming into his game throughout the year, I think you're going to see them start to propel upwards. If you get 2 wingers or an attacking midfielder in there that are particularly potent in front of goal, then you'll start to see his assists or stats in the build-up really start to elevate. And I think that that's one of the things that actually Mitrović is really underrated for, is his link-up play. And we saw this hugely against Luton. As soon as Mitrović switched himself and started to go a little bit deeper, looking for the ball and looking to get a hold of it in those transitions and bring others into play, that's when Fulham clicked into a different gear. And that's when Tom Cairney got the goal, because the attention shifted from Mitrović just being flat against that back four, really easy to keep under wraps. All you've got to do is nick around the ball or just out-jump him, and that's it, that's attack over. To then him drifting in, taking one of those centre-halves out, preoccupying someone else, causing a little bit of confusion. That's where those gaps start to open. And I think that that's where Fulham are really going to have to be starting to play up to that in the Premier League next year. I think a lot of his passing ability goes under the radar, and we've started to see that come out under Marco Silva. And that's where you get a player really starting to believe in himself, because the coach does as well. And that's, unfortunately, what Parker never gave Mitrović.
Yeah. No, and I think that's the thing in terms of that build-up play as well, is that making sure, because obviously we're going to have to replace Fabio Carvalho. We're most likely looking at potentially Manor Solomon as a first choice left winger over Niska and Skibano. What I think is really important and what we're going to need in order to break Premier League opposition down is runners beyond Mitrović.
Yeah.
Because I think that's where we start to cause issues. I think we'll see less of, Mitrović has scored a lot of goals this season where it's been very simple of shift the ball out wide, put a good ball into the box, and he's just good. You're relying on him being better than opposition defenders.
Yeah.
Premier League teams are much better at stopping that. One, stopping it at source, so the cross doesn't come in the first place. But two, they're smarter. They're better at dealing with intelligent forwards who are good in the air.
Yeah.
So I think where we then start to look at causing teams problems is getting people in behind Mitrović, going past him so that he can then bring them into play when he drops deep.
100%. I think this is where some of our transfer targets are going to be those hybrid midfielders that we spoke about earlier in this episode, where they can play multiple roles and they're going to be able to flood the box, because I don't think Fulham were going to stray too much away from the playing style they have this year. Maybe slightly more defensively minded in the back third of the pitch. But in terms of the cutbacks and hitting Mitrović as a reference point, I think that will still be very prevalent to the way we play. So it's going to be a particularly interesting summer as we go into the Premier League as champions. And I think in terms of this episode, that's about us wrapped up for it. But I'd like to say, on behalf of Dan and I, thanks for all the support that you're giving the whiteboard. The viewing figures have been really, really good, and we're being inundated with questions. One thing that Dan and I are basically talking in the background is, how do we keep these episodes nice and short for all of you guys to digest it? But secondly, how do we cover everyone's questions? So I think we've got quite a lot of material for the summer, haven't we, mate?
Yeah, definitely. And very keen to keep going. It's just, I think we said it on the last time, it's so exciting to be a Fulham fan right now that it's just a pleasure to keep talking about it.
Oh, definitely. And obviously we've got the whole summer coming where we're going to be looking at how players or new signings can slot in, how players are going to be evolving in this squad and in this system as we take that big step into the Premier League. So it's going to be an exciting time for us, 100%.
Yeah, really looking forward to it.
Good. All right, mate. Well, that's the end of the whiteboard, episode 3. Thank you again for all your support. If you have any questions for me and Dan, please feel free to send them across on Twitter, Instagram, into the Fulhamish email address, or if you're in one of our Telegram groups, please just drop it in there too. We are more than happy to answer. So, Dan, thanks again for your time, mate. Cracking insight as always, and look forward to the next one.
Always a pleasure. Thanks very much, Jobs.
Cheers, mate.